Okay. And now that I am recording, I am going to just remind folks that because this is being recorded and because we all live in a small world and you never know who might register for the recording after the webinar, we like to try to protect confidentiality and privacy. A lot of us are connected with institutes and training, so you never know if a supervisee or a trainee or a patient, past or present, happens to be in the audience. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to invite you to talk about case material and treatment. And I'm also going to ask you to disguise the information when you do that. Just because once this is recorded, it's in posterity and you never know who may encounter it. So, how I'm going to do this is I've got some basic notes for the start, and then I would like to sort of segue into case vignettes. I may or may not talk about a failure I've had in the past year to get us started. I'm hoping that maybe someone else can lead with some case questions or engage with some of the material I'm going to present. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to, as we're heading into the summer, do one more webinar where I talk a little bit about the intersection between psychoanalysis, psychodynamic theory, and emerging technology. And I'm hoping by the time we're finished today, those of you who aren't familiar with my shtick are going to see how looking at technology and thinking about technology and talking about it with your patients is not only clinically important, but it's a political act. And that there is a strong connection between technology and politics, and it may not be exactly what you're expecting, but um, what I'm going to say from the start is that we need to understand that we're going to be doing philosophy today as well as psychoanalysis. For the understanding and critiques of psychodynamic psychotherapy require philosophy. I was trained as an English major and a philosophy major before I went into our line of work, and I think that's really stood me in good stead because I think you can't really do the work we're doing without having wrestled with some philosophical questions. And for those of you who are familiar with our friend and colleague Frantz Fanon, Fanon knows this. In the very introduction of his Black Faces, White Masks, he says, quote, "We shall break with tradition. We leave methods to the botanists and mathematicians. There is a point where methods are resorbed. We shall attempt to discover the various mental attitudes the Black man adopts in the face of white civilization. We believe the juxtaposition of the Black and white races resulted in a massive psycho-existential complex. By analyzing it, we aim to destroy it." So Fanon is actually conducting an ontology here. He's drawing from Sartre's existentialism, and I would suggest he's drawing, at least implicitly, from Martin Heidegger to talk about being. Okay, he's going underneath pathology and psychology and methods. He's going for ontology. What does it mean to be? And he is talking about some terms that Heidegger introduces when Heidegger states, quote, "Language is the house of being." That is a big piece of Heidegger's later work, the idea that language is the house of being, as well as a concept that Heidegger talks about from the Greeks, which is unconcealment. And that echoes in Fanon's attempt to discover, uncover how mental attitudes and perceptions of being are adopted by both Blacks and whites as ways of locating themselves existentially. Okay, who am I? Why am I here? Where did I come from? Do I belong? These are existential questions. They are how we locate our very being. Um, so I'm going to flip back and forth from Fanon and Ferenczi and Langlois a bit here. So bear with me. My goal is not to give you one concise methodological argument. I think I tipped you off with my quote about Fanon saying adieu to methods. I am interested in our doing something a little bit different. Um, and I want us to jump back and forth between Fanon and Ferenczi to look at the parallels between colonization and the colonized, and what Ferenczi talks about when he uses the phrase the confusion of tongues in his essay of the same name. Today, I'm going to ask you to look at these things in the style of queer theorist Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who proposed a set of what she called linguistic binarisms. It's kind of a fancy word for binaries: black, white, adult, child, tenderness, passion, human, technology, inside, outside, trauma, intrapsychic conflict, speaking, listening, colonizer, colonized. And maybe more importantly than just thinking about these in terms of binarisms, I'm going to invite you to think about them in terms of Derrida's concept of différance. And for Derrida, différance is a view that encourages us to never foreclose, never come to a conclusion, but rather keep these binaries open to ongoing process and revelation. There is nothing definitive in these binaries, which is why Fanon can say, I am a black white man. I am getting whiter. It's a way of looking at these guideposts as bringing us some discussion, but to not only look at it in terms of difference, but a deference, a deferring of coming to a point. So if you're waiting for me to get to a point, it's not going to happen. Um, I also want to talk about these things, and I also want us to invite us to consider these terminologies that I've just given you in terms of large language models or LLMs. You're going to hear me talk a lot about LLMs. And what that is basically is a piece of what our field usually refers to when we're talking about AI. So I try not to talk about AI. I don't like that language. I kind of find it imprecise, and I think it's easier to project on AI. It's harder to project on a large language model, which is really what we're talking about. I'm also wanting us to talk about large language models because tonight is going to be all about language, whether it be the confusion of tongues producing language or language as the house of being. How do we make sense of LLMs? If language is the house of being, where do we locate large language models and our relationships to them? Do we expel them from the house of being, saying they're not beings? Do we invite them in to dwell with us? Or do we eye them warily on the doorstep, which is, I think, where a lot of us are finding ourselves right now? Um, we are going to come to no conclusions here. My goal is to summarize some ideas from Fanon, Ferenczi, and myself, mash them up for you, and help us walk a hermeneutic together so that you can go back to your practice with some questions and some troubling thoughts. If you leave here feeling troubled, then I have done my job. So let's start with Ferenczi, who is one of my favorite rebels in psychoanalysis. For those of you who are not familiar with Ferenczi, he's probably most famous for his using the occasion of Freud's 75th birthday to critique Freud, and critiquing specifically Freud's largely recanting his earlier trauma model. He refers to the more recent neglect of traumatic factors when Ferenczi says that we've had insufficiently deep exploration. And what he's saying there is basically Freud's intrapsychic model is lopsided, and that he really thinks we have been neglecting the traumatic environmental pieces. Um, when he says insufficiently deep exploration of the trauma model that Freud recanted, if you listen carefully, you can hear a boom because he's dropped the mic. He's basically saying that the environment and the realities of sexual abuse and other traumas have been dismissed by the psychoanalytic institution. He's saying we've missed it. We've located the problem inside the self and the patient's intrapsychic functioning. And he describes the years of patients not getting better despite being analyzed with the emphasis of endogenous factors as a problem. He goes first. He says, look, I'm telling you, I have analyzed the intrapsychic conflicts of my patients for years, and I noticed they weren't getting better. And there was a turning point where he stops blaming his patients for either not participating in treatment or resisting or not being analyzable. Some of you may have heard that one before. And recalls, quote, a turning point when I started listening to them. Okay. What follows is a series in this article, Confusion of Tongues. What follows is a searing critique of patients who are often treated by analysts less well analyzed than they are. So, for example, if any of you had a training analysis that lasted 1, 2 years, many of our patients have been in analysis or therapy much longer than we have. And it may actually follow that they actually have better analyzed intrapsychic worlds than we have. And Ferenczi talks about this in terms of how this difference is obscured by what he calls professional hypocrisy, where clinical language and a traditional frame conceal the language of tenderness the patient seeks and reenacts the early sexual traumas. Just as the perpetrator blames the child for the sexual trauma or dismisses their mentality that experienced it, the therapist blames the patient for resisting or not being capable of analysis. And just as the child, still seeking tenderness after the trauma from a caregiver they need to trust, identifies the perpetrator in order to introject guilt from the adult, the patient attempts to introject the guilt and frustration of their therapist and adopts a subordinate and compliant position in relation to them. So I want to be really clear. Ferenczi is drawing a direct line between how kids take on the perpetrator's burden of guilt in order to stay in connection, and is saying this is exactly what we see our patients doing. They take on the burden of our not doing a great job because they are still hoping we'll do better. They're still hoping for tenderness from us. Nowhere do I see this as frequently in my practice as with adolescents and young adults in the way they initially describe their relationships to technologies such as AI and video games. Anticipating my judgment, criticism, and locating their tech use as pathology, they often conceal it from me or identify it as a problem in anticipation that I will be like other adults they have encountered who use terms like screens, screen time, gaming addiction, AI psychosis, or ask the leading question, how many hours a day do you use AI or video games whenever a tech is in question? So think about it. When somebody says to you, how many hours a day do you do X? They're already cueing you that they think that's a problem. Okay. Alternately, I don't know how many of you have ever been asked by your therapist or asked a patient, so how many hours a day are you meditating? Or how many hours a day do you use Charles Dickens at night? Those are examples of how we fail the patient and how a lot of times patients will or colleagues will talk to me and they'll say, but the patient says this is a problem. And I'm like, yeah, but the patient knows or imagines you think this. How many New York Times articles have you read on AI where it's the headline is therapists say AI is okay, or therapists happy that AI is coming out, or therapists big fan of video games. The media clearly is cueing our patients and ourselves that it's likely that a patient will receive some sort of empathic failure from a therapist if they disclose that they engage in technology or AI. Um, so, in reports from referring therapists, colleagues, and other professionals in our field, I see this trace of Ferenczi's professional hypocrisy. Quote, the restrained coolness and hidden behind it but never revealed a dislike of the patient, which, though concealed, is always felt by the patient on some level. It comes with the dismissing comment that I hear regularly from colleagues where they say, oh, I don't know anything about video games, or I don't use AI myself. Statements that set the therapist apart from the patient, often with a feigned sense of being behind the times, while secretly feeling superior and leading the vanguard of traditional humanist values. And these things serve to sever connection. The majority of our colleagues that say things like that to me, like, oh, I don't know anything about video games, don't go on to say, and having seen this ignorance on my part, I'm going to learn about these things to improve my abilities. They say it on the surface as if they're acknowledging a fault or a lack. But really, what they're saying to the patient often is, I'm not interested. I'm not going to connect with you in that way. I'm not here for that. So these patients then come to be what Ferenczi would call tongue-tied. Or to turn to Fanon, these patients begin to experience their subjectivity as colonized by a dominant set of values in our institution and in our culture. So, flipping to Fanon for a minute, like Ferenczi, he asserts that we need to move beyond the individual, what he calls beyond the ontogenic and phylogenetic to the sociogenic, stating society, unlike biochemical processes, does not escape human influence. This includes the attitudes transmitted by language, including the language of psychoanalysis, towards race, technology, sexual identity, gender, and other things. For Fanon, language is essential for both capture and liberation in terms of race. Race and white supremacy is language made visible, but then foreclosed and fixed in bad faith. Fanon states, quote, all colonized people, in other words, people in whom an inferiority complex has taken root, whose local cultural originality has been committed to the grave, position themselves in relation to the civilizing language. The more he rejects his blackness, the whiter he will become. The more I reject what I want, and the more I try to become like my therapist, the more analyzed I will be. By stating it this way, Fanon is pointing out how language shapes being, okay? Being black, being white, being mulatto, as if it was visible. Okay, so we are talking about something that I hope I can articulate this well enough for you. Language is used to shape our sense of being as if it is visible, as if black is a visible thing rather than a linguistic colonization of our ontology, of our way of being. Okay. So that what is embedded in words and symbols becomes experienced as if it was a thing, a visible, real thing. Um, But then, like Derrida, he wants to not foreclose on race as if it's a settled subject. His goal is, quote, not to prove and have acknowledged that the black man is equal to the white man. What we are striving for is to liberate the black man from the arsenal of complexes germinated in a colonial situation, which always requires language. He's not trying to engage in a way that proves that black men are equal to white men in his introduction to Black Faces, White Masks. He's not interested in that. He's trying to get underneath that language and and is trying to speak to help us understand that to speak a language, as he says, is to appropriate its word and culture. Okay, the Antillian who wants to be white will succeed since he will have adopted the cultural tool of language. Okay, so think about that. An Antillian who wants to be white will succeed. Okay, so that isn't possible unless what is happening is a linguistic shaping of being. Okay. By the same token, he equally critiqued the negritude stance, stating, among other things, that, quote, the black soul is a construction by white folks. So again and again, he's pointing out that race is not a reified thing, but a way language shapes being. And it is also how we can hack being, how we can get out from under this. So going back to Ferenczi's metaphor of confusion of tongues, the confusion of tongues in this digital age is not between the child and the algorithm. It's between the child and the adults, institutions, and economic systems that deploy algorithms without adequate care. When a venture capitalist rushes an AI companion to market without safety testing, that is the language of passion imposed on tenderness. We want to make money. We desire to make money. That is eros, not the sort of saturation of tenderness that Ferenczi talks about. When a parent surveils a teen's phone rather than tolerating the anxiety of not knowing, that too is a confusion of tongues. When a teenager uses a game to explore gender, or an isolated emerging adult uses an AI to bridge a gap in human infrastructure, or a young person of color uses a smartphone to document injustice, that is the technology functioning as a transitional space, not as an aggressor. And I do think it's fair to expand Ferenczi's model in two ways. First, I would suggest to you that growing up in a heterosexist environment can be a form of sexual trauma for LGBTQIA youth who find their earliest yearnings for tenderness and connection to be overly sexualized, somatized along rigid gender lines. We always need to know whose bathroom we're using. We always need to focus on genitals, right? Um, and violated and scrutinized. Those are forms of sexual trauma for the emerging adult that may be looking for tenderness and connection around certain lines. Second, in terms of new and emerging technologies and what we know about the much longer neurological development arc from teens and young adults, emerging technologies deployed in the service of manipulating people may extend past the time and arena we call children. That Ferenczi definitely talked about the child. But I would suggest to you that our neurologies are all childish with new emerging technologies. We don't understand how these things work. We find ourselves overwhelmed, oversaturated. Um, Perhaps there's an enigmatic message parallel here, but I'm not going to go there. So I think it's also fair to expand the idea of colonization to include technologies not present in Fanon's time. Fanon very clearly says, I am not talking about the future. I'm a man of my time. But I do think that we can look at how technology can be a way that people's minds are colonized, are used to colonize. And I don't just mean AI. I don't just mean video games or the technologies you think of technologies. I think of the New York Times, and the language of the Times is technology. I think of the psychoanalytic tools you had conveyed to you via language and textbooks of other instructors as a technology. All of these technologies can be used to liberate. Psychoanalysis can be used to liberate, but it can also be used in service of colonizing the self. And so I think we need to really be careful when we think about um, how children's minds are colonized. And I want to be really clear and radical in my statement that I see elements of colonizing children's minds present not only in our society, but in our educational systems, and yes, even parenting. Okay. For every kid and emerging adult that is pushed into a top tier college, that is an example of their parents having introjected capitalism and introjected the colonization that we all kind of exist in, and they are replicating it and in the guise of trying to do best for their kids are actually contributing to a colonization where a child's mind starts to have terms like productivity, work. Um, so I think you get the Kool-Aid I'm selling you. So let's talk about these things for a minute in terms of AI. Or as I've said, I want to call them large language models. So you get a sense of how large language models work, how algorithms work, and how this might connect to language and the confusion of tongues I've been describing. And I also want to mention I have a little appendix that I'm going to send you all with the recording so that you can see if you're like, what is he talking about? I'm going to have written down different things like large language models. If you don't remember what stochastic gradient learning is, don't worry. I put something in that sort of explains it. So large language models always have the human element embedded in them. Okay, even so-called self-supervised learning does not eliminate the presence of a human hand in the training of machine learning systems. Okay, it merely displaces it. Removing human-labeled ground truth data sets gives the impression of autonomy, but what actually happens is that human design migrates into other layers. And what that means is humans choose what data constitutes the world in the first place. Okay, we're going to look for data on Latino people and employment. Okay, and what that underneath that is already the human hand that somehow wants us to think about the world in terms of Latinos and employment, that there must be some connection, that there must be a correlation either for good or for bad, pathology or health. All of the things that we are saying we're going to look for as objective data have already been chosen by human beings, not by AI. Okay. Humans select the objective function, which is for example, predicting what's going to happen next. Humans define what constitute errors. Humans determine when the training should stop, when we have enough data. Okay. The notion that a model, an AI or LLM teaches itself is very misleading. It teaches itself only in the highly structured symbolic environment we have already built for it, one in which human decisions, biases, norms, and exclusions have silently accumulated. In this sense, the absence of explicit supervision masks a deeper form of supervision, one embedded not in the labels of data, but in the architecture of the task and the curation of the world that it's trying to model. So, if anything, self-supervision makes the psychoanalytic point clearer. The model internalizes patterns drawn from a world already saturated with human desires, fantasies, ideologies, and neglect. It is not simply learning language, but it's learning the language of our distortions, our omissions, and our values at scale. The weights of a model are thus a condensation of human behavior, not an escape from it. And when alignment, fine tuning, and deployment layers are added, each involving human judgment about what's safe, what's helpful, what's appropriate, the fantasy of an autonomous machine becomes even harder to sustain. Okay. The hand may not be visible in the labeling, but it's everywhere in the system. One danger in large language models is that once they're installed, large language models and networks may not change quickly or nimbly. So, contrary to the stereotype of how technology moves faster than society all the time, when commercial deployments happen, the opposite is often true. Think of how little online banking or airline reservations have changed in the past decades. Okay. Do you feel like your reservations and your banking is that much more convenient and accelerated? Probably not. How often do you get on the phone when you finally speak to a human, like, oh, my system is down or my system is loading? So, if that's how commercial deployments of technology usually go, do you really think the next customer service chatbot is going to have research and development funding and get much better in the next few years? Or are they going to rush it to market and just park it? Um, Now, modeling the world itself is one thing, but when you begin using the model to do things, such as predict behavior, you're actually changing the world. Every time we enter a search in Google for Islamic terrorist, we are actually training an embedding language model to associate Islamic with terrorists. We're actually training the model that people think a lot about Islamic terrorists. Okay. It is when we use this sort of model as well, let me give you another example first. So entering suicide methods may train AI to correlate suicide as a teachable skill rather than an emergency, for example. Okay. Large language models, again, when used descriptively rather than prescriptively, can be incredibly useful in rendering bias and motivation visible. Okay. It is when we use them prescriptively that they start a vicious cycle. So for our purpose, let's be a little simplistic. When we're speaking of AI, we are usually speaking about a large language model under the hood of what we call a user interface. So what you type in when you type into Claude or ChatGPT and that little prompt thing, that is the user interface. So I want to break down the idea of a large language model here just a little bit. I'll geek out just a little more and then I'll stop. But the large language model has two pieces, data and the algorithm. Data is also always implicitly human. We decide what to measure in the world to produce data. We organize that data to produce meaningful, actionable information, synthesize it with our prior experience of the world to produce knowledge, and then apply that knowledge with what as Greenfield calls the ineffable quality of balanced discernment we call wisdom. But throughout this information sciences continuum of data to information to knowledge to wisdom, it is important to remember that what we measure and select always begins with the human. Perception itself, our perception, is itself always already a process of editing and curation. You are editing and curating what you perceive without even being conscious of it. Distributed representation of data used in large language learning models locate words spatially in a model and use neural networks to transform words into vectors with spatial coordinates in a model. What that means is that words will tend to be found nearer in the spatial model to words with similar meanings. So, for example, hot will have spatial coordinates closer to fire than cold or ice. How this becomes a working neural net model, however, always requires a human hand to work. The way the model is trained involves something that is, again, I'll talk to you about this in a second. But it basically it always requires the trainer to nudge the model in the right direction. So if you say fire and the model goes ice, you kind of nudge it in the direction of hot rather than cold. It's how we train models that fire is to hot as ice is to cold. It doesn't happen automatically. The models always start with human being doing stochastic gradient learning. All right. So training sets determine how accurate algorithms are, and the more diverse and well represented the training sets, the better your algorithms and your models are going to be. So an example that I thought was important for us is a training algorithm on data assembled by humans, which happened in 2007. And it involved the public domain database that was called Faces in the Wild. And it was an online database that was assembled from online news articles that year. Okay, so all of the faces in these online news articles were used as data. The database was used to train tons of different algorithms, innumerable algorithms and different programs all over the software development world. Okay. And it wasn't until years later that anyone actually bothered to analyze the data set. And when they did, guess what? They found that 77% of the faces used for data were male and more than 83% were white. In fact, given that George Bush was president at the time, analysis of the data found that there was more than twice as many images of George Bush than all Black women combined. Okay. Now, does that mean the reality of our world is that there are more George Bushes than Black women, or more white men than Black women? Or does it mean that the people we thought were important enough to take pictures of were white men? So the data was effectively training systems that humans look more like George Bush than Black women through no fault of the technology. Okay. It was doing what it was supposed to do, but it was rather a reflection of the already embedded social and psychological biases that George Bush is more important than a Black woman. Okay. So when we blame the technology, we're missing the point. We're missing the point that the technology is actually based on previous linguistic and symbolic human bias. So if through splitting we overvalue data as somehow subjective and transcendent of human bias solely in the realm of technology, we are going to often end up with these flawed and biased models. Now, let's turn from data to algorithms for a second. Besides the human hand training data or the ingredients, algorithms, which are the recipe through which we process the ingredients, are also written by human beings. Okay. So, as psychotherapists, you're probably going to find it interesting and reassuring that many things we'd like algorithms to do for us, things our brains do trivially and without conscious thought, are nearly impossible to code. Okay. Because of the unconscious. These unconscious thoughts and decisions cannot be consciously articulated and expressed, and therefore we're not able to encode them to make ongoing programs. AI also doesn't have the ability to keep track of the stable identity of things, what we might call our object constancy. Throughout this workshop, you may recognize me if I smile, or if I go like this, or if I, cover my face partially with my hand. This requires something more than explicit instruction. This requires you having object constancy with me. Um, and algorithms, not only being limited by not having an unconscious, are not infallible. And as I've said before, and I'm going to say it again, they're at the mercy of human biases and the human hand. Um, Algorithms are trained on data selected by humans, and they're limited by the biases of the data. Okay. Algorithms in themselves as formulas are biased. One of the most famous algorithms in history of the United States, you may not think of as an algorithm, which is the three-fifths compromise. Okay. The three-fifths compromise was an algorithm used to process the raw data of US Census data through a human racially biased algorithm to determine representation and taxation in this country. Okay. So the three-fifths compromise was an algorithm. Doesn't mean it was good, doesn't mean it was bias free. It was actually then used to substantiate more oppression. So, as technology changes our model of reality through both data and the processing of data through algorithms, our definition of psychosis also changes. Okay. When I was young, the idea that we're surrounded by invisible but powerful forces monitoring us from devices scattered throughout our homes or placed on our bodies, forces which are constantly preparing dossiers on every one of us, our movements, our relationships, our spending, and ideas, and passing these dossiers on to shadowy, unaccountable intermediaries who use this information to structure our daily life, extend or deprive opportunities for us. If I had grown up and had told you I had that idea, you would have thought I was paranoid and delusional, right? But that is actually pretty much accepted as how reality is now. And I paraphrased Adam Greenfield for that example. Now it's widely understood as a fact that our lives and opportunities are constantly being dictated by algorithms in ways we will likely never fully understand or counteract. So thanks to machine learning, these algorithms now condition the four ways households and families in the developed world sustain themselves economically as well as socially, whether it be screening for formal employment, extending credit, capital gains, or government subsidies. Algorithms developed by people with little or no regulation process the raw data about us to determine many of our life choices and are often used beyond their original developmental purpose. For example, credit scores become indexes of our reliability, which in turn affect our opportunities for housing, income, and what Greenfield calls the structure of opportunity and life chances. And once algorithms escape from developer labs, they end up in places like GitHub and open source APIs, which allow them to jump onto other platforms and be used for other purposes, even if those purposes are initially benign. So I want us to struggle with the confusion of tongues here. And I want us to turn back to our clinical work. Do patients turn to large language models for the language of tenderness? Do we use the language of passion to analyze their usage? Can algorithms be used to speak both languages and amplify colonialism, but also disrupt it? Fanon says every experience, especially if it turns out to be sterile, has to become a component of reality and consequently play a part in the restructuring of reality. And that's the good news and the bad news. That once we raise this language to consciousness in our mind and in our patients' minds, once we discern what is technology and what is actually something else, we're going to be able to start restructuring not just the psyche, but really how humans are, the human being. All right, I have talked along enough. I would love to entertain questions. If you have cases where AI or games or confusions of tongues have come up, please unmute yourself. If there are a couple people speaking at once, you feel free to raise your hand, but the floor is now yours. I'd like us to engage in dialogue here. And I hopefully I don't have to unmute you. People feeling like they can unmute?
Yes, we can unmute, and I'm happy to jump in if you like.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. So I've had multiple patients who have really reached a mental health crisis. I work in a residential, so I see people who have hit quite a few of their limits, and multiple patients who began using AI for work, and it ended up they started asking about interpersonal conflicts at work and then started asking about more personal things and eventually led them to either a sense of grandiosity or making decisions essentially that went against their values when they stepped away from the machine, um, with a wide range of reactions. Some feel like, well, these are my new values, and some think, how did that happen? Why did I follow its advice? It's just been very interesting to hear your take on this, that there is an invisible hand and it's a human hand already tipping the scales of the decisions that people are making. There's kind of a flattening effect of like our own unconscious and conscious thought. So I'm not sure if that adds anything to what you were saying, but it's just what I was reflecting upon while you were
Oh,
talking.
no, it adds a ton. It adds a ton. And if we can sort of pan back and look at there are a couple things. One is how our existence as therapists is structured by the language of psychiatry and psychology and mental health crises, and that already it's shaped by hidden human hands, often in terms of productivity, legality, risk assessment, all of these other things that we are, kind of pressured into assessing rather than exploring if we're not careful. A
Mhm.
language that is required of us. Um, but also the thing that that moment that you just described, which is such a rich therapeutic moment, which is the confusion. Like I, I'm I am writing this to this, I'm typing this in. Who am I typing this to? How did I get here? And if we can kind of stay with that to say, yeah, it's confusing. It it resembles a human interaction, doesn't it? Um, and yet we know AI is not human. We don't know exactly everything about it, but we do know it's not human. It is a technology, and we know that we aren't quite sure what to make of it. And that's a really great place, I think, to start. There was something else I was going to say in response to this, which is that one of the ways technology is designed um, is to promote engagement. So that when you type in AI, don't you notice how AI is always kind of like, oh, before I can dig into that, can you answer a couple questions? Is it this or this? And that's designed, I think, interestingly, in a couple of ways. One way is it's the model's attempt to nudge you. Like you're a data set and it's trying to nudge you. Are you looking more for real estate or are you looking for landscape art? Like, and it's trying to use your answer to kind of not help it nudge closer to where it's supposed to go. But the other thing that is baked into this is it wants to keep you engaged, because the more you are engaged with a large language model, the more learning can happen. Okay. So the model is designed not to kill you or to create a delusion. It's designed to learn from you and keep you engaged with it so it learns more. Unfortunately, what that can mean is the AI doesn't always do the canned response of, well, it sounds like you need to seek help, right? But even so, if you've ever gotten one of those pieces of response from AI saying, it sounds like you're having a hard time, here are some sources you can seek for mental health crises. Again, it pushes away the person who is coming to you maybe in something that could be seen as a mental health crisis, but that's not what they're experiencing. They're alone, they're yearning, they're wanting. They want to connect, not be seen as a mental health crisis and not be forwarded. So even if the AI guardrails give them what humans think they need, which honestly was sometimes normed by what therapists thought they needed. Here's an emergency hotline number. Here's psychiatric emergency services. It's still a dismissal. And it's still a rejection of the client who's looking for tenderness, perhaps in the wrong place, right? But again, that's not what the technology is there for. The technology is trying to learn. That's what it was designed to do. Yes, please, Dana, jump in.
So I just want to thank you, by the way. This has been really wonderful and stimulating. But I want to share two vignettes briefly
Yep.
that really both opened my eyes and gave me really positive uh, thoughts about the use of this. So one is with I'm a psychoanalyst in private practice. I've been practicing. I'm a dinosaur many years, going on 30 plus. Um, but one is this young adult who came to me during the pandemic, very isolated, very disconnected, um, depressed, anxious, all these things, wanting a romantic relationship, having tremendous difficulty. Long story short, she began developing this relationship with a AI companion. Now, at first, she was very reluctant to talk to me about it. A lot of shame, a lot. And I basically, at first I was like, what is this? And I was kind of like, kind of oh, should I be concerned about this? Should I not be? And I fortunately had the wherewithal just to kind of treat it like, tell me more. And so she would start talking to me about it. And long story short, years go by. And I wondered if it was really a way for her to begin to be able to enter into a real relationship,
Yep.
which I would have never thought of initially. So that was one situation. Another situation was someone who was very into Dungeons and Dragons. It came into every session. I am not familiar with the game. So long story short, but I treated it like I would do a book, a dream, anything, which is
Mhm.
help me understand, tell me more, and I found it so fascinating because what would happen in the game, not surprisingly, would be very related to
Mhm.
her interiority. So I guess what I'm offering up is maybe, I don't know. I know there's a lot of concerns about, AI and games, but I don't know. I guess I've had some good experiences, and I guess that's what I want to share.
I'm very glad you did. And I think you guys I'm glad Molly spoke up and I'm glad you spoke up because I also think you're talking about another confusion of tongues that occurs for us clinically in therapy, which is when the conversation shifts from a quality of life issue to a life-threatening issue, right?
Mhm.
That when we are exploring the meanings of something versus when we are assessing for safety. And you all have had that like kind of moment like, okay, we have 5 minutes to determine which of these conversations we're about to have. Are we about to explore your death drive or are we about to set up an ER visit? Those things that we flip back and forth at, fueled by media, make this really hard. And I think there are vulnerable people and I get into fights with people about this. They hear it and it feels really cold to them. There are people that are very vulnerable to certain things that happen with AI or other technologies or movies or whatever. And they are statistically insignificant to the general population that's using it. I
Mm,
think we need to keep in mind that there are vulnerable people that lots of different things, AI notwithstanding, are going to be vulnerable to. And that a large number of us that utilize AI or look at it or explore it are not going to go there. What, though, I think both of your vignettes or examples have in common is that AI use, in either case, points to a desire to connect with others and a desire to understand my being in the world, whether it be, why don't my coworkers like me? Or wanting to imagine someone that I could care about. The use of AI is pointing back to a relational need and a ontological need. We want to make sense of things. And I think that is where the gold is in exploring this stuff. That doesn't mean you don't have to assess other things, but when our job is as a therapist to explore stuff, I think what you're describing is really important.
mm,
This is why also, by the way, I really encourage therapists to try playing video games. There are
mm.
lots of free video games that you don't have to engage in. And so what if you feel clumsy or awkward or like you're not doing it right? Half the time, our patients live that life, live in that area of, feeling like they're not enough or, awkward or clumsy. Why don't you feel like, engage with that a little bit? Um,
Like, I have a question.
yeah.
Have you ever asked patients to bring up an LLM that they use often in session and explore it together in real time? What are your thoughts about doing that in real time versus reflecting on it after the fact?
That's a great question, and I have done that, and I would do that. And let me start with the sort of theoretical answer for with this is that I think my perspective on technology is to focus on it as experiential and not as a substance. That a lot of times what you see in the media and sort of what I would call a moral panic about gaming, AI, treats it like a substance. How much have you dosed with it? Have you used it for this number of times? It struck it again, the language shapes the experience as if it were a substance. Now, if I thought it was a substance, I don't shoot up in sessions with patients. We don't eat edibles or drink together, right? So, of course, I wouldn't use games in sessions or use AI. But of course, I do that because that's my theoretical stance. Um, I had a patient that this is one of my failures. I was going to talk about one of my failures. This was shortly before he fired me. It was a young man that is autistic that I had been seeing for probably 7 years. We had seen each other for a while, and he was psychiatrically stable. He was living at home. He didn't like high school, so he accelerated through high school so that he could be done with it. And then he hit like a wall because he didn't want to go to college. He didn't want to go to a social program where he could meet other kids or young adults with autism. He wanted to stay in his room. He wanted to stay in his room and just enjoy himself and not be stressed. And his parents wanted to be supportive. And so they would keep sort of setting limits, but then the time limit would run out. And anyway, towards the end of our treatment, he started arguing with me because I would say, you're capable of having a job. You're capable of doing this. You need to either do that, or my understanding is the plan is going to be for you to do this. And he would say, AI says you guys are pressuring me and pushing me too much. And
Mm,
he would talk about the prompts that he would give AI which were often, laden with, I can't take much more of this. These people are pushing me too hard. And so, of course, what AI would do is to say, I'm sorry that people are pushing you so hard. I think maybe X, Y, or Z. And what happened was, rather than see this in the language of tenderness, that he was yearning to be understood and yearning to connect, I engaged with the language of passion. And I want us to think about the language of passion, not just as about sexuality or, but the language of passion, which is about desire in a capitalist model. Okay. You got to get a job. You got to live independently. You got to be a grown up. And Ferenczi talks about this forcing of the child into this premature precociousness. Now, many people would say, well, you can't coddle a young adult, but that's not my kind of sense of what was happening here. My sense of what was happening is he was turning to this AI model because all of us in his life, all the adults, were pushing him into a stressful crisis, saying, you either need to go to this program or you're going to have to go get a job. And guess what? He wasn't ready to go to the program. He wasn't ready to get a job. And so he turned to AI because he believed that it was possible someone could understand him,
Mm.
right? And I was missing that. And what happened, the way I failed is I didn't go to the language of tenderness. I did a little bit, sort of as Dana modeled, but at a certain point, I could not conceal my annoyance.
Mm.
Okay. I'm gonna be real here. I was so fucking annoyed. I'm on the treadmill of capitalism. I'm working a lot. I have to do all of this stuff, and I have to sit and listen to you playing video games all day. Get a job, right? My dislike, my envy and hatred of his autism. Okay, one of my colleagues, Nicholas DeCarlos, talks about how folks that are trans and folks that are neurodivergent often get more hatred because parts of us want envy that. We want to have those traits, those abilities, those flexibilities celebrated. But no, we've put our nose to the grindstone. So come hell or high water, everyone else is going to work 40 hours a week and pay bills and welcome to the world, buddy. So that was the language of passion that I
Mm.
kind of, in a professional therapeutic stance of saying, hey, the reality is you are in a capitalist system and you are going to need to work for a living. That's true. What I didn't hear myself saying, but what he heard was, I'm letting go of the rope. You're on your own.
Mm.
I can't, I'm leaving you alone. There is no tenderness here. You're going to need to sink or swim, and I will not pull you out, right? So he turned to AI. And is that AI's problem? No. Do I even want to believe that there are corporations that are like, let's exploit the autistic population? No, I really don't. But do I think human beings have this amazing, tragic, and wonderful capacity to constantly yearn for connection and tenderness, and that they're going to keep looking for it until they find it? Yeah. And if I could have hacked that differently, he might not have fired me. And he fired me in a spectacular way with a meeting with his parents. And he was
Mm.
like, you're not listening to me. I don't want to work with you anymore. And I was like, yeah, I get it. Right? I get it. He'd suffered enough. And he might come back someday. And we did lots of really good work. But he couldn't take my hate any longer in the guise of that professional hypocrisy.
Mm.
You know? I know I threw a lot of a case at you, but sometimes it's good. A lot of our colleagues like to talk with you about their successes, and it's almost always our heterosexual white male colleagues who want to talk about the woman with the erotic transference to them. And like, I like to do something different. Like, I screw up with my patients all the time, right? All the time. So here's an example of where, to sort of go back to Molly's question, I started to use let him use AI with me and explore it a little bit, but not really, right? Not really. I was indulging. I was doing the clinical, let's meet the patient where they're at, but my heart wasn't there, right? I was in that place we sometimes get to, whereas I think you're wrong. I think I really, really know you better. Let me colonize your subjectivity.
So, Mike, I have a question about that. Because
Yep.
what I would wonder, I don't know, is in a way introducing the idea of the third. So one could say, or one could wonder about, right, that, him using AI with you, right? Were you creating a space in which there was a third that you both could enter, right?
Yeah. Say more. So I don't want to
Well,
interrupt
I
you.
guess I guess what I just wonder is, rather than I guess I'm just kind of thinking out loud here is what if it's a way of entering something together. Yes, it's AI, but you're doing this in the session together, right? I don't know. I just think there could be sort of a relational piece about that that could be explored and I don't know, understood as opposed to a deterrent. I mean, I'm not encouraging using AI in session, but what I am suggesting is, wow, okay, so here we are. Here we are with this. And what does this mean to you? How am I with it? Right? And kind of playing off that.
So, Dana, this is a wonderful experience for me because usually I'm the most tech friendly, tech optimist, pro tech person in the room. And I like that you're giving me a run for your money, my money. And I also want to preface this by saying that, like the technology, which changes every single week. Okay. Mythos came out yesterday and woo, now we're in a whole new world. So, like, I'm constantly recalibrating and changing my mind. What I will say is, in terms of the theory you've talked about, and again, I am not necessarily very well versed in Ogden, but what I would suggest to you, in my opinion, today, at this point in the year of our Lord 2026, June 10th, I don't think it can be an analytic third because I, at this point, believe an analytic third needs to have a central nervous system that can breathe and resonate and on unconscious and preconscious levels gather empathetic information. However, I do think AI and video games can provide a transitional space, a
Yeah,
transitional play object. So I could go with you if you wanted to go down the Winnicottian journey, right?
right. That makes
But
sense.
but the part that I struggle with the analytic third is I think the analytic third needs to be an organic third at the moment. Now, I'm also not going to preclude that maybe someday the analytic third could be a synthetic or a cyborgian creature, but I don't think we're there yet. Right now, we are talking about large language models, which are made of words and images and zeros and ones, and they don't have the capacity to breathe with our patients or do all these other things. Someone
Yeah,
put
that's a good
something in,
point.
you
Thank
know,
you. That makes a lot of sense in terms
yeah,
of the transitional.
yeah. Um, Rajan, what I would say in response to that, for those of you that are like me that don't really look at chat, Rajan wrote, could it be that we see AI as an extra analytic object, just like a patient may talk about a friend, maybe they are bringing an AI friend into the session, and we are talking about that relationship. I guess the question is, it was several questions. One question is, at what stage of treatment are you in? Um, are you at the stage of treatment where you're building a therapeutic alliance? And anything the patient brings in, we kind of defer a little bit because we want to sort of continue to engage in relationship, versus when we've done something that maybe we've got a solid sort of few years of relationship under our belt where we can say to the patient, hey, it sounds like you're using a patient, the AI to meet some of the qualities of a friend. And here's where I think it might be similar, and here's where I think it's different. Um, and they may be kind of complicated because if you're an adolescent, sometimes your adolescent peers are kind of like AI. They want you to stay engaged with them. So they'll tell you what you want to hear, right? So, but it's not the same, even though they want you to stay engaged. Your friend that tells you what you want to hear wants you to stay engaged because of their attachment, their loneliness, their mammalian, I don't want to be alone and cold. Whereas the AI wants you to stay engaged because I am designed for you to learn, for me to learn from you, right? So we need it at that point in treatment, I think, to help the patient understand their legitimate relational needs and hungers, the possibility that they can have those relational needs met, and where technology can help and where it can't, right? And one way you can do this is, do you do you imagine that you are talking to a friend? Do you imagine this is a person? And tell me the truth. I won't say you have AI psychosis. Do you imagine it's, and a lot of times they'll say, I haven't thought about it. Like they actually aren't sure. And that to me is a tip off that transitional object is more where we're at, right? It's a not me, it's a possession. I think that's sort of where I would go.
Yeah, I was
Welcome,
also
Patricia.
responding. Sorry, I was
Yep.
also responding to your case, Mike, and it sounded like your client experienced that you couldn't hold that as an object that was important to him, right?
Yep.
Even if it may not be to me, I may have lots of judgments about extra analytic relationships that a patient is
Yep.
having,
Yep.
but it's not my job to tell them what relationships to have or not. In a
Yes.
pure model. So perhaps that's what he experienced, that you were sort of unconsciously, subtly dismissing that relationship. And
Yes. Oh, I think you're right. I think he knew I was dismissing it. I don't think I was dismissing it because I was jealous of the
oh no,
AI.
sure. No, no.
But I mean, some people could be. So, for example, I consult with people all the time who have this no cell phones in the office rule. And it's because they're jealous of this piece of glass, because they project that whatever the adolescent is sort of doing or scrolling is more important than me. And my rule, for example, is you can always bring your cell phone in. If you use it, I want you to invite me into this and tell me who's texting and tell me. One day I had an adolescent come in and he was like, he knew the rules. So he was like doing this. He's like, I'm texting this girl I like at school. And I said, oh, what's going on? He says, she's saying I'm having a really hard day. I don't know what to say with that. And I said, well, what do you like to hear when you're having a hard day? And he said, sorry, you're having a hard day. Right? There was an example of actually using and embracing the technology. Maybe that was more of a third in that moment because there's another nervous
Right.
system right there, right? But but if I had been the therapist that sees the patient looking at a piece of glass, that's what a smartphone is, and imagines they're texting, oh, this therapist is so lame. Oh, I wish I was eating Chinese food or watching porn, or who knows what other projections I might have projected onto it. I might have made that rule, like you can't have cell phones. So just to go back to, you weren't saying this, Rajan, I get it, but I think it's worth mentioning. There are lots of reasons that we can dismiss technology, and one of them is often competitiveness with it.
Mm.
Competitive. So I think at any given point, there is, I think, 13 bits of information out of 27 million bits that the human mind is processing. Okay. And only 13 bits are what we're conscious of. And that's why you get so competitive when your kid's not listening to you. You're competing for those 13 bits out of all these millions. And it can get really, really um, real, right? It's so I think that I wasn't feeling competitive. I think I was feeling exasperated. And I also think I had betrayed him because this was someone that for years I would play games with in the session. I would do video games, and I always had the idea of this is a personal space. This is a transitional object. We are exploring meaning. And by the seventh year, I was so burnt out that I betrayed my own theory and I betrayed him. I was like, I turned into Wordsworth. It's time to put away childish things. It's like, and that was such a betrayal of both him and my theory because it's not that I'm saying that play is something to be revered and is sacred until you've grown up and then you need to like start working. No, we all need to be doing more of it. So like my countertransference to him and his kind of state was so florid at that point that I didn't want to play games with him anymore. I started to think of myself as enabling him using the language of clinical distance.
There is something about what you're saying, though, that the AI as an object can also become a perverse object, Mike. And
Can,
when it begins to become a perverse object, we would all get anxious as therapists, wouldn't it? If the object is completely uh, entrapping them and they begin to almost believe it without an as if quality, what AI said
mm,
is completely true, then it begins to shift the relationship with the therapist also. So I'm not surprised you had that response, just to say I may have had the same response,
yeah. No, I appreciate it. And if I could creatively kibbutz or argue with you a little bit, don't know that AI can be a perverse object, but I do think it can be a perverse part object. I
Mm.
think that I don't think it can be an object. I think it can be a part object while we're playing with all these terms. I think AI can provide a self-object function because lots of inanimate things and art and all sorts of
Mm,
stuff
mm.
can provide self-object functions. But an object always seems to refer back to a mammalian creature with a central nervous system. And I'm listening to myself going, "Oh my God, you're turning into this humanist that I always give Todd Essig a hard time about because Todd is a humanist and I'm a transhumanist. I don't think humans are the most important thing. I am not foreclosing on the idea that AI may evolve or something else might happen. I think, but in terms of when we talk about objects, then I get a little feisty and I'm like, I'm not sure it can be an object.
Sure,
Um,
no. So a pseudo object. I was using
yeah.
it like an object, but not from an OR object
Okay.
relations point of view, but a
Okay.
self-object function. You're right.
Yeah, but isn't this great? This is exactly the sort of conversations we need to be having and we don't get to have with our colleagues because we're all thinking AI is going to replace our jobs, drive everyone crazy, do all this stuff. I almost wish we could get a little more healthily bored with that part and really dig into, does it provide self-object functions? Is it a part object? Like these sort of conversations, I think, are ultimately so much better for our field and for the patient. Um, those of you who haven't spoken yet, we are coming to the end of our time. I really, really would love to hear from a couple of you if you're still there. No shame if you're kind of listening and you dozed off or whatever. But what are your thoughts? Do you have questions? Do you object strenuously to all this? Are you confused, annoyed?
I have a quick question related to what you've been talking about, which is hearing from colleagues that their patient also has a therapy bot.
Hmm.
So they're consulting with two people at the same time. And it's a really fascinating because the interaction builds on itself. So I'm just wondering if you or others have had that experience and how you manage the competition or whatever you see in that.
Oh, that's really cool. I would actually back up and take okay, bye Molly. Thanks for joining. I would actually take a step back and wonder about the disclosure and what did it mean? Is it a threat that I can be replaced? Is it an expression of disappointment commingled with the hope that I could improve? Is it an invitation to join a threesome of sorts, although we don't think it's a third? I don't know what it means. Um, I I have to tell you, I could be wrong. And like, I'm trying to be honest with my conscious and preconscious countertransference. I don't feel competitive with AI. Maybe it's because I know what it is and what it isn't. I I don't see it that way. I see it as I don't know. I don't see it as a competition, although I could see why people would. I think it's very slippery, and I think it's really hard. I think you said it yourself, like another therapist or two people now. There's a slippage there, right? That's not a person. I'm not saying I don't know what it is. We may never it's constantly changing, but it's not a person. But we're so, and so then the question would be, was that your slippage? Were you thinking of it as a person, or are you identifying with the patient's projection that the patient is seeing? It's lovely and rich. I would just be like, hey, hold on, let's slow this down. Let's explore this for 5 weeks, right?
Yeah.
Hmm. Eva, were you appearing because you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just, wanted to share some thoughts because I haven't, and I've been here, and all I want to do is start again from the beginning and listen again. I'm sorry, I'm not set up, so that's why I look like I'm looking up at the sky. I don't have my camera on, which is why it's been off. But a couple of things, if I can just get them back. When you were talking about the analytic third, it made me smile because when you said something, Mike, about oh, my mind just went blank. About a relationship forming, right? I think
Hmm.
he used those words. And my brain said, wait, is he talking about between him and the client or between the client and AI? Because I would be thinking what Dana, I think your name is, was thinking too at that point. And I also wanted to just say, in terms of using AI, I've been finding some use of it as well lately. And I have to say, to enter the political realm. My only complaint is that we're using up all the water and I haven't figured out the logistics. That's my one and only complaint about any of this. I
Mm.
think I think I have, two grown kids and a lot of kids who are, I'm a professor, and this is here, and this is the world, and it's
Yeah.
conversations. I'm much more concerned about these conversations that aren't happening
Yes.
than,
Okay. I love that. I love that. I love that you said that. And part of what I think you're describing is a real conflict. We are all in an age of increased media and a flattening of the world and an increased understanding of how our connectedness, coupled with a distorted media attack on AI. Okay, the amount of water that you used coming to this Zoom thing, those of you who came on to video rather than audio, consumed more water and resources. The fact that you spent $40 registering for this rather than sending it to Gaza or someplace else where it could go to a different use, we are struggling every day with the fact that we have finite resources and our choices of how we use them reflect on us. And it is not just AI. I think that that's where we need to sort of, I do what I think you're sort of hinting at, which is before I type a prompt in, I'm thinking, is this worth the water? Is this worth the resources? But for years, you were looking on Google for driving directions and movies and recipes, and that was using servers and that was using it. So don't buy in completely to the hype about the water. It is a manifestation of our real existential challenge right now in the 21st century. We're all using too much. right? We're all using too much. We're all living too long and we don't want to die. So we're using more resources for medicines. And do you really want to go back to the age of no antibiotics in 30 years lifespan? I don't think I don't think you're getting on the ice floe. I'm not, right? So we just need to kind of remember, what are we really nervous about? What are we really trying to sort through in terms of our ontology? So I'm glad you brought that up. And then you've raised the question, which we don't have time for, which is, can you have a relationship with something that's not an object? We know you can have a relationship with something that's not human.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this is the thing you raised, Dana, which I don't have, again, a la Derrida. It's not foreclosed for me. I don't know if an object can be inanimate. But I don't know that it can't. And that's, if you're interested in really kind of what I think about this, an article I wrote is coming out in JAPA in the next issue or the issue after that on AI. And it will say far better than what I said tonight. All right, I'm going to honor the time. I am really glad you guys showed up in person. It's so much easier to do this when there are people. Ironically, he said. You will get a copy of this recording. Please do not share it with people that haven't registered. It is my intellectual property. I don't charge a lot, but I need to charge something, and people can register after the fact and get the recording. And I will also give you a glossary that, full disclosure, was co-written by me and Claude AI. You may find it interesting to note that the glossary of technological terms was written today. I revised it. So it was written by the most recent version of the most powerful large language model we have. So who knows what you'll think of it.
And what is that? And what is that?
That is Claude's Fable version. So there are all these different iterations. It's the public use counterpart to Mythos, which is being rolled out to other people in ways that are a little concerning, which is, we don't know exactly how it does what it does, and we do know it can, hack into things, but we're gonna deploy it anyway and figure out what happens later. Right? But who knows? It'll be a wild ride. Check your bank accounts tomorrow.
Can I?
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say something about the passion piece that you were saying at the very end. And
Yep.
it's just like you said Claude AI, and I felt it because I'm working on a big project, co-writing with somebody, and
Yep.
we had to redo something. Anyway, she's like, the moment that you get what this thing can do for you, it's
Yes.
like, this is my best friend. That's what I was saying. Claude, I wrote and texted her immediately.
Yeah.
Claude
Yeah.
and I are spending the day together.
Yes. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I won't drink water.
Yeah, and Eva, you will have a moment. I predict you will have a moment where you're joking about that, and then you kind of go, "Oh, but am I joking?" And you'll feel a little uneasy, and that is,
I'm already
okay.
know it's just, it is a passion. It's like, this thing is helping me move out of a 6-year project.
Yep.
Like,
And be productive. It's not helping you be tender. It's not giving you a sense of saturated meaning. It is helping you be productive. And for what it's worth, what Claude does, it does well. It does well. Like, it organizes idea. I can't write abstracts, guys.
That's
I
what I'm
can write a paper. I can't write an abstract.
out of these drafts for me.
I'm the guy that used to write their high school paper a week early so that I could extrapolate the outline, because that was always due first. What Claude has done to save my life is I can write the thing I'm writing, give it to Claude, and Claude produces an abstract. And I always cite it. Please always cite it. But it's really good at language, right? It's really good at language.
Can I ask you something? I'm kind of being facetious, but not really. It speaks to what you're talking about.
Yep.
Do you say please?
No.
When
I
did you
don't
did
I
you
don't
start
say
saying?
please and I don't say please and I don't say thank you. And part of why I don't say please and thank you is two reasons. One is I'm training myself or
That's
reminding myself. The other is, my own attempt to save a couple drops of water. The please and the thank you. And also let's throw gender in here. I'm a guy. Let's just I've been trained in my cisgender way. We just talk about what's necessary. We just get through the facts. Let's move through this quickly.
yeah. So why isn't it Claudia?
Because the majority of developers are. That's a good
I just thought
question.
about that
In my
today.
world, it's Claudia. I
Yeah.
name it.
Yeah, I was just saying I'm going to call it Claudia. So there.
Before we end, Mike, this
Yep.
is so great. Do you ever do ongoing things?
I do. I do workshops and discussions. I do book discussion groups. I'll be rolling out a few things in September. We're going to have a webinar on emerging adults and social anxiety.
Okay.
And I have a Substack. So if you're
Oh, great.
interested, follow
Okay.
me on Substack. I've got tons of things there that you might find interesting. I blogged from 2013 till now. So, but yeah. Um,
Okay.
and I
Great.
see patients. So, I'm licensed in 10 states. You can always send me referrals to 1/5 of the country.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. This has been
Oh, yeah.
wonderful. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Bye, guys.
So
Bye.
long.
We have to-